There's a saying that goes, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." It is precisely what happened with a woman named Isabella. After she had been buried alive by her own husband and his mistress, she was saved by a stranger who would change everything for her. She was only going to be there for the weekend, but little did she know that this visit would end up being the last one. As soon as she arrived, her family welcomed her with open arms. They hadn't seen her in quite some time and were glad to have her back, so they spent the entire weekend sharing stories and catching up with each other. The suspense was thick in the air, making it hard for her to breathe. Suddenly, Mark stopped and turned to her, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He motioned for her to look at something behind him, and Isabella's heart skipped a beat. It was a typical day in suburbia when Isabella decided to visit her family home. It was something about the chest that seemed strangely familiar to Isabella, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As she reached out to touch it, Mark grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. A loud crash from downstairs broke the tension, and both Isabella and Mark turned to investigate. It was clear that he wasn't afraid of the intruder at all. Instead, he seemed almost amused, as if this was all part of his plan. "Don't worry, my love," he said, his voice a low growl. The stranger swung at Mark, sending the hammer flying across the room. Both men lunged for the weapon, but it was the intruder who grabbed it first. He held it high, his gaze unwavering. "I'll make sure you get some rest now." He raised the hammer above his head, and Isabella closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. But the blow never came. As she spoke, the stranger's expression changed from anger to understanding. He looked down at Mark, who was now groaning on the floor. "What are we going to do with him?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. The stranger hesitated, torn between his desire to help Isabella and his distrust of Mark. "Alex, thank you," she whispered, "for saving me." He looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "I couldn't just stand by and watch him hurt you." When she finished, he pulled her into a tight hug. He had shown her what it meant to be loved and cared for. She knew that she didn't want to let him go. One day, as they were walking hand in hand through a field of wildflowers, Alex stopped and turned to her. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "No one should ever have to go through what you did." Isabella leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body and the strength of his arms. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. He looked at Isabella, his eyes filled with sympathy. Then Isabella noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. Alex slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her passionately. In that moment, Isabella knew that she had found her happily ever after. Mark was holding a hammer, the same one that had been hanging in the garage just moments ago. Isabella looked into his eyes and saw a kindness that she had never seen from anyone else. She knew that she had made the right decision by leaving him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows on the road ahead, Isabella turned to the stranger beside her. She had a million questions running through her mind, but didn't know where to start. Without hesitation, she took his hand and let him lead her out of the house. Mark snarled, lunging at the intruder, but he was too quick. The intruder easily dodged the attack and swung the hammer back, hitting Mark squarely on the head. Mark crumpled to the floor, clutching his head. As the days passed, Isabella found herself growing closer to Alex. He was kind, funny, and most of all, he listened. He didn't try to push her to talk about what had happened with Mark, but he was always there when she was ready to share her story. He gestured to the chest, which had fallen open during the struggle. As they pulled up to a quaint little cottage, Alex turned to her. "This is where I live," he said. "I hope you don't mind staying here for a while." She told Alex about her marriage, about how she had been trapped and abused by her own husband. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. It was the first time she had spoken about what had happened to her, and it felt good to finally let someone in. Isabella's heart sank as she realized that the stranger knew more than he was letting on. Whoever it was seemed to have broken through the front door. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Why did you hurt him?" Mark looked up at her, a twisted grin on his face. "He doesn't know what he's talking about," Isabella said quickly. She didn't want the stranger to hurt Mark any more than he already had. Now, fear twisted Isabella's heart as she contemplated her situation. On one side was her husband, whose face had taken on a terrifying appearance. On the other was an unknown intruder who could potentially save her. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and said, "Do you remember this?" The question hung in the air between them, and Isabella felt a surge of panic. By the time Monday rolled around, Isabella was ready to head back home. But before she left, her mother gave her a warning. Finally, she shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. As she carefully examined the items, she realized that they were from her own childhood. Her mind raced, trying to understand why Mark had shown it to her. In that instant, Isabella saw not her loving husband, but a complete stranger. Then her blood ran cold as she realized that she didn't know him at all. She screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. Trapped, she looked at Mark with wide, terrified eyes. Was he trying to manipulate her somehow? Just then, Mark stepped closer to her, his presence looming over her like a dark cloud. "Don't you recognize me?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Isabella stared back at him, confused and afraid. How had Mark known that she would want to see these things? Had he been hiding them from her all along? With trembling hands, she opened one of the letters, its words spilling out onto the page. It was a message from her late grandmother, filled with love and warm memories. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't remember." Mark's face softened and he let go of her hand. He opened the chest, revealing its contents. Isabella gasped. She told her daughter that she needed to be careful with her husband, Mark. Lately, he hadn't been acting like himself. But there was nothing she could do about it, or so she thought. She turned to her side and found Mark staring at her with a sinister smile on his face. His eyes seemed to hold a dark secret, and Isabella couldn't help but feel uneasy. Mark leaned closer to her, his breath hot on her ear as he whispered something that sent chills down her spine. He told her that he had something to show her, something that would change everything between them. When she got back home that evening, she noticed that Mark was already waiting for her. He greeted her warmly, which was unusual since he'd been so distant lately. This change in behavior only made Isabella more suspicious, wondering if he was up to something. He'd been distant and cold towards Isabella, which worried their mother. Isabella tried to shake off her mother's concerns, as just that, concerns. However, deep down, she couldn't help but worry about her marriage as well. Over the past few months, Mark had become increasingly distant. It seemed like he had something to hide, and it was driving Isabella crazy. The next morning, Isabella woke up feeling as though someone was watching her. As Mark led Isabella through the dark and twisty corridors of their home, she couldn't help but wonder what he had planned. In front of her stood a wooden chest, its surface intricately carved with mysterious symbols. She racked her brain, trying to remember any chest that they owned. But the more she thought, the more confused she became. Inside lay a collection of old photographs and letters, all tied together with a faded ribbon. Isabella felt a lump forming in her throat as she read the letter. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning flashed outside, illuminating Mark's face in an eerie glow. But then the most unexpected thing happened. She glanced back at Mark and noticed a glint in his eye. With shaking hands, he approached her, his eyes gleaming with a dark light. When she opened her eyes, she saw the intruder standing between her and Mark, a wild look on his face. "Stay away from her, you animal," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. As the stranger approached him, he saw the wild look in his eyes. Oh, does he not? The stranger turned to her, his eyes narrowing, then, "Explain this." Taking a deep breath, she explained to him what she had found in the chest, the old photos and letters. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I had no idea." Finally he spoke, his voice firm. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe," he said, offering her his hand. As they drove away from Mark's house, Isabella couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He must have sensed her thoughts because he turned to her and smiled. "My name is Alex," he said. Isabella felt a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, but she wasn't sure if she was ready yet. "Thank you," Isabella whispered. "I won't stay long." One evening, as they sat by the fire, Isabella finally began to open up. Hush listened, patiently, his hand resting on hers. As the weeks turned into months, Isabella fell in love with Alex. "Isabella," he said, his voice serious, "I love you."